Hello everyone, in this video I will be recapping the chapter 51 of the Manhwa demonic evolution. While Aang was pulling the sword out of the demon's chest, he praised Sidu Liu for making quick movements. Upon hearing this, she asked him to not forget about the fact that the Sidu family was a martial arts family. She also added that the moves she had made were basic moves. Aang pulled the sword out of the demon's chest and placed it on his shoulder. Then he looked into Sidu Liu's eyes and explained that they needed to hurry away from the area since the sound of their fight must have attracted attention from nearby demons and warriors. She began to stare into his eyes and simply stayed silent, listening without saying a single word. Aang looked to the side and started walking. At that moment, Sidu Liu looked more closely at Aang's face and saw that he had a small cut on his cheek. She called his attention and explained that he had a wound on his face. She suggested going to a safe place so she could heal the wound for him. Aang closed his eyes, put his hand on his cheek, and while he was wiping the blood away, he smiled and explained to her that he had accidentally caused this small wound. He asked her if it was necessary for such a small wound to heal and also if she saw him as a weak person. Upon hearing this, she began to stare into his eyes intently, and with a serious expression reminded him that this time they had agreed that it would be her responsibility to heal. She also added that it didn't matter if the wound was big or small, she had to heal it regardless because otherwise her existence would have no meaning. Aang closed his eyes, slightly lowered his head, and while touching his forehead with his finger, he thought to himself that Sidu Liu was serious and brave, and for this reason she was known in Helos as the non-smiling Rakshasa. In the end, he decided not to argue with her and asked her to heal the small wound on his face. At that moment, she looked up and was shocked to see someone approaching them at high speed. Immediately, she asked Aang to be careful. The person who wanted to attack them by surprise was none other than Other's elite bodyguard warrior. In the blink of an eye, he appeared above Aang and Sidu Liu. While staring at them with a murderous look, he prepared to attack using the giant axe. Aang looked at her and upon seeing her expression, he was shocked and began to wonder what she was talking about. The elite warrior grabbed the giant axe with both hands and struck Aang with all his strength. The blow was so powerful that it even shattered the ground into pieces and created a curtain of smoke. Sidu Liu managed to react in time. She activated the green core and quickly gained momentum as she threw herself backwards. Just before the elite warrior's giant axe could impact Aang, he swiftly unsheathed his sword and placed it against his neck, effortlessly blocking the attack. He slightly turned his head back, and while staring fixedly at the elite warrior, he began to wonder why he had arrived so quickly, if only a few seconds had passed since the fight against the demon had ended. The elite warrior stepped on the blade of the giant axe and thought that defeating Aang was not easy. Then with a killer look he stared into his eyes and explained that in the end, the judgment he had made had turned out to be correct. Seeing that Aang was able to react and block his attack as if it were nothing, the elite warrior realized that he was not a quadruple-finned warrior. Aang simply remained silent and did not say a single word. While the elite warrior was staring into his eyes, he revealed that he knew his core far surpassed that of a quadruple-finned warrior. Aang began to raise his sword, causing the elite warrior's giant axe to slowly retreat, creating sparks in the process. Quickly, the elite warrior stepped back several meters, crouched down on the ground, and rested the giant axe on his shoulder. As the sparks were slowly falling to the ground, he simply stood there looking at Aang and didn't say a single word. He was a 6-fin red core warrior who could control the earth element. Upon seeing that he had let his guard down, Sidu Liu activated her core and began to advance quickly towards him with the intention of attacking by surprise. But just before she could make a move, something sticky and green appeared near her face. Upon realizing this, her expression changed drastically as she didn't know what was happening. She slightly turned her head back and was left speechless. Behind her stood the blonde woman who had been accompanying Other and the elite warrior. She extended both hands near Sidu Liu's face and activated her 3-fin green core, using the element called Paralysis Drive. While she was staring into Sidu Liu's eyes, she smiled and explained to her that because she had focused all her attention on her partner, she had been able to deceive her so easily. In a matter of seconds, Sidu Liu's body became paralyzed, and it didn't take long for her to realize that she was in trouble since the blonde woman had used a unique paralyzing ability from the green core. The blonde woman approached Sidu Liu and asked her if as a member of the green recovery team, she knew what was happening. She explained to her that the paralyze ability was originally used to treat wounds, but if transferred directly into an opponent's body, it completely deprived them of their ability to move. She took several steps until she approached Aang. Then she placed both hands behind her back and began to stare into his eyes. Aang leaned the sword on the ground, stared directly into the elite warrior's eyes, and finally realized who was behind it all. While the elite warrior was crouched down with the giant axe resting on his shoulder, he stared at Aang and asked why he was staring at him so much. Upon hearing this, Aang started to get angry and asked why he was attacking him instead of protecting Other. He also added that this place was a site where life and death were uncertain. At that moment, he looked to the side and saw Other approaching them. He put his hands in his pockets and asked Aang why he remained so stubborn on the brink of death. Then he began to stare into his eyes with a murderous look, and with a smile, he asked if he didn't want to lose his life in front of his own wife. Upon hearing this, Sidu Liu was shocked and started blushing. She began to wonder why Other had said she was Aang's wife. Thinking about this, she couldn't help but get angry. She clenched her teeth tightly and while staring at Other decided to stop thinking about the matter since it wasn't a good time to be upset. Other approached them, and while he had one hand in his pocket, with the other he gave a slap on the buttocks to the blonde woman. Then he winked at her and praised her for doing a good job. He also added that in return, he would reward her appropriately once they returned to the city. As she thought about the reward, she started blushing. Other approached Sidu Liu and gently held her chin. Then he looked into her eyes intently and with a smile asked her to wait because later he would also give her a reward. While both were looking at Aang, Other explained that he wanted to see how she watched her beloved husband die. He also revealed that later on, he would play with her calmly because she was the only woman who had rejected him, and due to this, he had become very interested in her. Upon hearing this, Sidu Liu clenched her teeth tightly and began to glare at Other with a murderous look. The elite warrior caught Other's attention and addressed him as young master. He asked why he had come out of hiding when he had ordered him to stay hidden until he eliminated the threats. He thought he could handle Aang on his own, so he asked Other to take Sidu Liu back to the city once they finished off Aang's life. While Other was touching Sidu Liu's chin, he replied that he didn't want to keep hiding as he felt suffocated. He explained to everyone that due to the presence of an elite warrior, no one would dare to attack them. Aang simply remained silent and didn't say a word. Seeing Aang's silence, Other stared at him and asked if he was underestimating a five-finned warrior like him. Aang didn't even bother to look him in the eyes, while his body was emitting a murderous aura. He looked down and explained that at first he had thought that young Other was just a wasteful young man, so he hadn't worried much about him. But now that he had seen him in person, there was no doubt in his mind that he really was trash. While Aang's body emitted a murderous aura, he stared down at the ground and his eyes began to reflect the anger he felt at that moment. He revealed to everyone that Other had hurt many girls. Upon hearing this, Other smiled and while pointing Sidu Liu's chin with one hand, he stared directly at Aang and mocked him for making such a stupid comment in this situation. He thought Aang was trying to act cool, so he revealed to him that tonight, he would harm his wife. Then, he pointed at Aang with his other hand and mocked him by calling him a four-finned trash. Upon hearing this, Sidu Liu started looking at him with disdain, and although she really wanted to beat him up, she couldn't do it because her body was paralyzed. The elite warrior closed his eyes and with a smile thought that in the Mir family they had raised a foolish and pampered son called the five-finned warrior, who had no idea of his own worth. He began to wonder how many connections his powerful and privileged father had made to make someone like Other reluctantly become something. He knew that Other was a warrior who couldn't even face a demon on his own, and he had empty thoughts, thinking that Other was a ridiculous person. He was a warrior with a six-fin core. He thought that if it weren't for the reward that the Mir family gave him, he would currently be a warrior with a lower fin core. For him, Other was a small repugnant creature who didn't even know the meaning of life and death. While the elite warrior was crouched on the ground with the giant axe resting on his shoulder, he closed his eyes and thought that he should have broken Other's neck a long time ago. Thinking about this made him angry, so he quickly sighed and changed his thoughts, deciding it was better to forget about it. He addressed Other as young master and reminded him that their lord had given them very clear instructions. He advised him that if he wanted to leave hiding, then he must follow the instructions to the letter. Just before the elite warrior could finish speaking, Aang interrupted him and while staring at Other with a murderous look, activated the core and revealed to everyone that he was going to end Other's life without any consideration. Aang gained momentum, activated the fire element, and in the blink of an eye, began to advance rapidly towards him. As Aang was approaching Other, he became confused and surprised at the same time because he didn't know what was happening. Seeing that Aang had planned to attack young Master Other, the elite warrior activated his core, gained momentum, and while staring directly at Aang, started moving towards him at high speed. While Aang was staring into others' eyes, the elite warrior began to wonder how it was possible for Aang to have the energy of the fire element within his body. At first, he simply thought that Aang was a four-finned warrior, but now he started to question how it was possible for him to control three elements. Seeing the speed at which Aang was approaching them, Other was left speechless and his expression drastically changed. On the other side, the blonde woman put her hand on her face as she knew something bad was about to happen. As Aang rapidly advanced towards them, he clenched his fist tightly, which started emitting fire. While giving Other a deadly stare, he called him a little demon who claimed to be a warrior, but was only a disgrace unworthy of living in this world. Upon hearing this, Other clenched his teeth tightly, and while staring into Aang's eyes, his expression drastically changed to fear as he knew he wasn't joking. Due to fear, he fell to the ground, assumed a defensive position, and begged Aang not to come near him. While on the ground, he began to wonder why such a strong warrior like himself didn't even dare to have a thought of resistance. He covered his face with both hands, and while looking into Aang's eyes, he began to tremble and wonder why he was afraid of a simple four-finned warrior. In front of him was Aang, who was emitting an intense and demonic aura. He gathered momentum and took a big leap, advancing towards Other while staring at him with a murderous gaze. Due to fear, Other closed his eyes and started covering his face with his hands. Seeing the demonic aura emanating from Aang's body, he thought that he was either a god or a demon. Sidu Liu and the blonde woman were also left speechless as they saw how Aang's body emitted a demonic aura. Other asked for help from the elite warrior, who quickly gained momentum and made a big leap. He gripped the giant axe with both hands and activated the core, slowly advancing towards Aang with the intention of attacking him by surprise. As he was moving towards Other, he slightly turned his head back and saw the elite warrior approaching him at high speed and ready to attack. The elite warrior targeted Aang's left hand, using all his strength to strike it. But just before the giant axe could reach Aang's arm, he quickly turned his body. In the blink of an eye, he made a complete turn, and while staring directly into the eyes of the elite warrior, he unsheathed his sword and prepared to attack. Seeing how quickly Aang reacted to his attack, he was both surprised and confused at the same time. He struck the elite warrior with his sword, but luckily he managed to block it in time. But due to the difference in strength, he was sent flying backwards. As he distanced himself from Aang, he stared into his eyes, clenched his teeth, and marveled at the flexible movements that he had executed. Due to the impact, a large smoke curtain was created. While he was looking at the smoke curtain, he began to wonder how Aang had managed to control the fire element. He had faith that his earth element would not be left behind. At that moment, Aang activated the wood element, causing sharp branches to come out of the smoke curtain and approach the elite warrior at high speed. As the sharp branches were slowly approaching his neck, he realized that Aang could also use the wood element. He quickly turned his neck to one side and was able to dodge the attacks, although in the process he received a small wound on his neck. He placed his knee and hand on the ground and was able to stop his moving body. Then, he started staring into Aang's eyes and wondered what was happening and how he could also control the wood element. He couldn't help but smile at the thought of having found such an interesting person. He had underestimated him too much, and now he was realizing that he had too many hidden secrets. He couldn't help but praise him for being able to control two different elements. He forcefully struck the axe towards the ground, causing it to break into pieces. Then, he activated the earth element, causing the stones to slowly stick onto the blade of the axe. While the stones were sticking to the blade of the axe, he explained to Aang that he was very curious to know how he was able to control two elements. He assumed an offensive stance as he grabbed the axe with both hands and raised it in the sky, his axe now being made of earth element with rocky power. He began staring into Aang's eyes with a murderous look and explained that if an elite warrior like himself could master the power of two elements, then he would be the strongest. With a smug smile, he promised him that in the next 10 minutes, he would make him reveal the secret to controlling two elements. Upon hearing this, Aang began to stare into his eyes intently, and while his body emitted a purple aura, he asked the elite warrior if he was sure about what he had just said. At that moment, a creature's hand grabbed hold of the elite warrior's axe handle. Realizing this, he started wondering what was happening. The creature that had grabbed the axe handle was none other than a 5-finned blue core demon. While the demon's body emitted the same purple aura as Aang's body, it began to stare fixedly at the elite warrior's head and started roaring. Upon hearing the roars, the elite warrior realized who was behind him. While he was staring intently at Aang, he began to wonder where the demon had come from. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.